Good evening, and thank you for slipping into Sleepy Kitchen with me. Tonight, fermentation is going to be our guide, not just through a jar on the back counter, but through the quiet life it lives around a kitchen. We'll follow it from the first simple mix, salt and water, cut vegetables, and clean glass, into the slow work you can't rush, where sugar becomes tang and time becomes flavor. We'll let it travel a little through old, practical wisdom, how people learned to keep food steady before modern fridges, and how a living process can feel like care when the day finally lets go. And we'll bring it right back home to the midnight truths, clean tools, steady temperatures, lids that can breathe, and the gentle myths about danger and rules that soften once you know what you're listening for. By the end, I want fermentation to feel like a familiar voice to you, a small, readable rhythm that makes the kitchen feel calm instead of demanding. If you want more Midnight Kitchen stories, you can subscribe whenever it feels right. Now lie back and get comfortable, and let the story do the holding for you. I know the quiet rhythm of a jar at night. Even now, I still pause when I twist the lid. That first scent is clean and sharp, with a faint sour edge behind it, like rain on warm stone. Here is the plain fact that holds the whole night together. In many traditional ferments, helpful microbes protect food by turning natural sugars into acid or alcohol. A simple trade, but it explains why something can taste alive and still stay steady. Now, let it meet the jar. Salt draws moisture forward. The surface turns glossy. Tiny bubbles arrive like soft punctuation. And in the gentlest way it knows how, the food begins to change. That tiny sound a container can make when it settles and releases a breath has a simple cause. Something inside is feeding and leaving a trail you can taste later. When I say microbes, I mean the unseen organisms that live on our skin, in the air, on the surface of vegetables, and even in quiet pantry staples like flour and rice. Most days, they are just part of the background of cooking. But under the right conditions, a few of them become useful partners, the kind that work while you rest and leave you something brighter in the morning. Fermentation is the name we give to the change those partners create when they begin breaking down sugars and starches. As they do, they produce acids, gases, and aromatic compounds that reshape flavor and often shift texture too. What starts plain can become lively. What starts sharp can become rounded. And what feels ordinary can begin to taste like it has depth, even when nothing extra was added. You do not need to picture a science lab to understand it. Think of it the way you think of a flame. You never see heat itself, but you recognize what it does to a pan, to a pot of water, to the edge of a sliced onion. Microbes are similar. You rarely see them directly, but you learn their presence by outcomes. You learn them by pattern. In many everyday ferments, the main helpers are bacteria and yeast. Bacteria are tiny single-celled organisms, and some kinds excel at creating acids that bring a pleasant tang. Yeast are also single-celled, and many of them excel at making carbon dioxide, and sometimes a little alcohol, as they eat. Those differences matter because they shape what you notice. Yeast often announces itself with bubbles and lift. If you have ever watched fruit juice turn lightly alcoholic, or seen a homemade ginger drink become fizzy, you have seen yeast's signature in action. Bacteria often announces itself with sourness and structure. A simple jar of carrots and garlic can go from raw and sharp to gently sour and snackable, with the flavors tasting more integrated, like they have learned to hold hands instead of pulling apart. The helpful part is not simply that microbes exist. The helpful part is that you can guide which ones thrive. That is the difference between a fermentation you want and food that simply goes off. A good fermentation is steered. You set up conditions that favor certain microbes, and then you keep those conditions steady enough for the change to follow a clean, reliable path. Spoilage is what happens when nothing is steered. It is the kitchen left to chance, and chance is not consistent. Guidance does not have to be complicated. It can be simple and quiet and repeatable. Clean containers, clean tools, a surface wiped down before you start, a lid that fits well. In a home kitchen, this is not about perfection. It is about lowering the number of surprises. It is about making the job easier for tomorrow you, the version of you who will open the jar and want it to smell right away like something safe, not something uncertain. There are 3 quiet knobs that matter most in many kitchen ferments: salt, temperature, and time. Salt is not only seasoning. In vegetable ferments, salt draws water out of the food, creating the liquid the microbes live in. It also tilts the environment towards certain helpful bacteria, while making it harder for other organisms to compete. It is a kind of gentle boundary, not a harsh barrier, just a nudge in the direction you want. Temperature is a speed setting. Warmer usually means faster activity. Cooler usually means slower change. I treat it the way I treat holding a sauce. Too hot, and it races ahead, becoming rough around the edges. Too cold, and it barely moves, as if the whole jar is speaking in a whisper you cannot quite hear. And time is the ingredient people underestimate. Early on, flavors can feel blunt, like the ferment is still speaking in short sentences. With a little more time, the edges often round out. The taste becomes more coherent, as if the jar has finally finished its thought. Another word you may hear is culture. In kitchen terms, a culture is simply a community of microbes that reliably does a certain kind of work in a certain kind of food. Sometimes, that community is already present on the ingredients, and you are just giving it a good place to live. Sometimes, you add it on purpose, the way you might add a pinch of baker's yeast or a spoonful of an active ferment from a previous batch to make the result more predictable. Either way, it helps to remember that a culture is not a mystery, it is a living rhythm. Feed it what it likes, keep it comfortable, and it repeats itself. Air, or the lack of it, is another part of comfort. Some helpful microbes prefer less oxygen. That is one reason people keep vegetables under liquid or pack them down so they stay submerged. The liquid becomes a barrier that keeps the environment more stable. It also discourages the kinds of surface growth that thrive where air and moisture meet. Other ferments need oxygen. Vinegar is a classic example because the microbes doing that work live at the surface where air meets liquid. In that case, guidance looks different. You keep the container clean, you allow airflow, and you let the surface do its slow work. This is why fermentation is not one flavor or one method. It is a family of relationships, and each relationship has its own comfort. If you want a simple mental picture, imagine setting up a small room for invisible guests. You choose whether the room is warm or cool. You choose whether it is salty or not. You choose whether it is airy or protected. Then you let the guests settle in. Because they are alive, they leave signs. Bubbles can be one sign, especially when yeast are involved. In liquids, you might see fine streams rise from the bottom, then vanish at the surface. In thicker mixtures, you might notice small pockets forming, like tiny dimples that appear and relax. Smell is often the clearest guide. Many active ferments develop a bright, clean, sour note. Depending on the food, you might catch hints that feel citrusy or herbal, or faintly like toasted grain. If the aroma feels sharp but clean, it often means something is happening in an orderly way. If it smells rotten, putrid, or unmistakably wrong, that is a different story. But most of the time, the useful signal is simpler than people think. Clean sour is usually a good sign. Harsh, foul, or nauseating is not. Texture can be the most satisfying sign because you can feel it even with your eyes closed. Vegetables can go from rigid to pleasantly tender while still keeping a crisp edge. Liquids can become slightly thicker. Pastes can become smoother, as if they have been stirred 100 times without you touching them. Sound can appear too, if you are close enough to notice. A lid can give a tiny tick as pressure evens out. A freshly fed culture can make a soft crackle, like carbonation waking up. None of these signs tells the whole story by itself. I trust the pattern, the look, the aroma, the texture, and the steadiness of the change over time. Fermentation is rarely about one dramatic moment. It is about small, consistent movements in the same direction. That steadiness is part of why fermentation feels so natural in a working kitchen, and also why it can feel comforting in a quiet one. It is background work that can happen while you do everything else. It can add brightness and depth without extra heat and without extra noise. It is flavor that arrives by waiting, not by pushing. And it teaches restraint, not because anyone tells you to be patient, but because you taste the difference when you stop interfering. You learn that checking is fine, but fiddling is not always helpful. You learn that small systems do better when they are allowed to settle into their own rhythm. There are also gentle myths that cling to fermentation, and they often come from the same place: a desire for certainty. People want a single rule, a single smell, a single timeline that applies to every jar. But fermentation does not work like that. It works like weather. You can understand the conditions, you can read the signs, you can predict the general direction, but you cannot force every day to feel identical. That is not a flaw. That is the living part. So instead of chasing strict rules, I prefer a calmer approach. Set the stage well. Choose your salt level with intention. Keep the temperature steady. Give it enough time to speak in full sentences. Keep vegetables under liquid when the ferment prefers low oxygen. Give airflow when the ferment needs it. Use clean tools, not because you are anxious, but because you are kind to the process. Then watch for the pattern, the gradual souring that stays clean, the bubbles that come and go, the aroma that brightens, the texture that becomes more pleasant, the slow coherence that appears when you stop rushing the story. And if you ever feel unsure, return to the simplest truth. You are not trying to make something happen through force. You are setting up conditions that favor the change you want. And then you are letting life do what life does when it feels safe enough to work. That is the heart of it. a small room for invisible guests, a steady environment, a little time, and the quiet satisfaction of opening a jar later and finding not chaos, but a calm result you can recognize. Lactic fermentation is the kind I meet most often in a kitchen, even when nobody stops to name it. It is the sourness that feels rounded, as if it has weight and patience, not sharp corners. It does not snap at you the way vinegar can. It settles in, then quietly brightens everything around it. A simple way to hold it in your mind is this. Certain friendly bacteria eat the sugars already living inside food, and their main gift back is lactic acid. That acid nudges flavor toward tang, and it also tilts the environment toward order. As acidity rises, many troublemaking microbes find the room less comfortable. It is not magic. It is a shift in conditions, the same way a simmer is different from a boil. One setting invites steadiness. The other invites chaos. You already know the taste, even if you have never watched a jar. You know it in yogurt. You know it in sauerkraut. You know it in kimchi. You know it in old-school pickles that taste alive, not like vinegar poured over vegetables at the last minute. Lactic sour often arrives with a soft fullness behind it, a gentle warmth on the tongue. I do not mean it tastes like dairy, because it can happen in cabbage and cucumbers and carrots with no milk anywhere nearby. I mean, it carries a kind of calm body, the way a chord is different from a single bright note. In a working kitchen, I keep lactic flavors close for a practical reason. They do more than add sourness. They can lift richness without making a dish feel thin. They can give roasted meat a cleaner finish. They can make a bowl of rice feel complete with one small spoonful on the side. If you have ever eaten sauerkraut with something fatty, you already know the effect. The cabbage is still cabbage, but time has built it a brighter spine. It tastes cleaner, and it makes the next bite feel easy. The ingredients that lead to lactic fermentation can look almost too ordinary. Vegetables, milk, sometimes grains, often just salt and thyme, plus a clean container and a steady place to rest. That is part of what makes it so comforting. It does not require special gear to feel real. It asks for attention, but not for performance. You set the conditions, then you stop interfering. When I ferment cabbage for service, what I notice first is not sourness. It is water. Salt draws moisture out of the leaves, and suddenly the shredded pile looks glossy, heavy, and alive. The jar becomes its own small weather system, humid and steady, with brine rising where there was none a moment ago. That brine matters because it is the environment the microbes live in. It is also the blanket that keeps the vegetables protected, stable, and mostly out of the way of oxygen. Within a day or two, the smell begins to shift. Raw cabbage can be grassy and peppery, sometimes a little sharp. Early fermentation often smells surprisingly clean, faintly fruity, almost like the edge of a crisp pickle. Later, the aroma deepens into something brinier and more savory, the kind of smell that makes your mouth wake up before you even taste. If you are listening for one reliable sign, smell is usually it. A good ferment tends to smell sharp but clean, like brightness that knows how to behave. It should not feel rotten, musty, or aggressively unpleasant. Clean and lively is what you want. Loud and wrong is what you learn to avoid. Sound changes too, though it is easy to miss unless the room is quiet and you are close enough to be curious. Sometimes there is a slow, tiny popping in the liquid, like carbonation, deciding it still has something to say. That sparkle is often carbon dioxide. Lactic fermentation can produce gas along the way, and you may see little beads clinging to vegetables or rising in lazy streams. You might even hear a lid give a tiny tick as pressure evens out, a small mechanical punctuation mark that tells you activity is happening under the surface. Color can shift in small ways. Cabbage can move from bright spring green toward a softer shade. Brine can take on a faint straw tint. Spices look different once they have been sitting in salt water for days, sharing their oils and softening their edges. I used to chase a perfectly clear jar, as if clarity meant quality. Now, I trust the pattern more than appearances. If the aroma is clean, if the taste is bright and not harsh, and if the texture is holding, then the ferment is usually doing what it is supposed to do. Texture is the most satisfying sign because you can feel it even with your eyes closed. Vegetables soften, but not in the way boiling softens them. They become flexible. The fibers relax. There is still a crisp edge, especially early on, but the bite stops fighting you. That is one reason people love lactic pickles. The crunch is different. It is not just stiffness. It is structure with a little give, like dough that has had time to rest. Yogurt teaches the same lesson in a different form. Milk starts as a thin liquid. Then, with the right culture and gentle warmth, it thickens as proteins set, and the taste turns pleasantly tart. Drag a spoon through yogurt, and it leaves a trail that holds for a moment before smoothing out again. I like that moment. It is quiet proof that something happened evenly. Not a rush, not a trick. Just a steady change that kept its shape. If you want to understand lactic fermentation without turning it into a lecture, compare it to vinegar in one simple way. Vinegar sour tends to hit the front quickly, like a clean snap. Lactic tang tends to build. It can start mild, then bloom, then linger in a way that feels satisfying instead of aggressive. That lingering quality is why lactic ferments feel so natural alongside rich foods. They do not interrupt, they balance. Some cooks talk about pH here, and the science is real, but you do not need a number to cook with it. What matters is the idea. As the food becomes more acidic, it often becomes more stable when things are going well. Acidity is one lane that guides food toward order. Salt is another lane. Temperature is another. Lactic fermentation often uses all three in a mild, kitchen-friendly way, and that is why it feels so approachable once you have seen it a few times. There is another detail that makes lactic fermentation feel alive in the best way. It is rarely one single microbe working alone from start to finish. It is more like a relay. One group gets established first, then another becomes dominant as the environment changes. That is part of why flavor evolves in stages. Early stage can taste like salted vegetables, simple and blunt, like the ferment is speaking in short sentences. Mid-stage can taste bright and crisp. Later stage can taste deeper, with a savory edge that reminds you this is more than sourness. It is seasoning created by time. In a quiet prep moment, tasting those stages side by side teaches you more than reading rules. 2 jars started on different days. 2 forkfuls. One tastes like fresh greens with salt. The other tastes like it has been slowly seasoned from the inside. It is still the same cabbage, but now it carries a new shape of flavor, as if it has learned how to hold hands with itself. Submersion is one of the practical keys that makes this steadiness more likely. If vegetables float up and dry at the top, that surface can lose its clean rhythm. It can taste dull, or it can invite the wrong kind of activity. So I press vegetables down until brine rises and covers them. I wipe the rim. I keep the lid clean. None of that is ceremony. It is simply setting the jar up to behave. Small steps that prevent you from having to solve problems later. And when I do taste, I keep it simple. One clean spoon, one small bite. Aroma first, then flavor, then texture. If the sourness is clean, if the salt feels integrated, if the bite still has structure, then the ferment is telling you it is on track. You do not have to stare at glass for 10 minutes. You just have to listen with your senses in the right order. There are many places to meet lactic fermentation beyond classic jars. Some cured meats rely on it for their signature tang. Certain cheeses begin with lactic cultures building acidity before curds are formed. Even cooked foods can pick up mild lactic notes if they rest and cool in the right way. But I like to keep the heart of it simple, because simplicity is what makes it useful. Lactic fermentation is a way of letting food become more itself. Cabbage becomes sharper and sweeter at once. Milk becomes thicker and more fragrant. Cucumbers become more cucumber, but with a brightness that makes a meal feel lighter. If you want one sensory marker to carry forward, make it this. Notice the moment the aroma shifts from raw and green to cleanly tangy, like brine and fresh-cut herbs rising the instant you lift the lid. That smell is a gentle signal that the jar is not just sitting there, it is working in the background, turning time into flavor, and doing it in a way that feels calm rather than demanding. Yeast is one of the oldest coworkers I know, and it never asks for praise. I cannot see it, but if the kitchen is quiet enough, I can feel the shape of its work. It is the kind of change that looks like nothing for a while, and then, without drama, the bowl is fuller. The mass is softer, the surface is smoother. It is as if the dough has taken a slow breath and decided to keep breathing. In dough, yeast feeds on simple sugars and releases carbon dioxide. Those gases become bubbles. The bubbles get trapped. The dough rises. A trace of alcohol is part of the same trade, and that is why a dough that is ready can carry a faint suggestion of ripe fruit and warm grain. Not sweet, not sharp, just quietly alive. The first time you watch it on purpose, it feels almost too easy. Flour, water, a little salt, a pinch of yeast, then time. Nothing looks exciting, and yet the whole bowl begins to change shape, like a tide coming in when you are not staring at the clock. In a working kitchen, I notice bread fermentation before I touch the dough. I notice it in the air. There is a scent that sits somewhere between cereal and fresh beer, light enough that you might miss it if you are rushing, steady enough that you find it again if you slow down. If you are listening at home, imagine the sound, not the roar of the oven, not the clatter of pans. Rising is quieter than that. It is almost like absence. Inside the covered bowl, inside the lidded tub, tiny bubbles are forming and holding, and the only audible proof is what happens when you disturb the cover. Lift the towel, loosen the wrap, crack the lid. Sometimes there is a subtle release, a small sigh, as if the dough has been keeping its own weather and you have opened the door to let it out. A dough that is waking up also looks different. Early on, it can be shaggy, uneven, like it has not decided what it wants to be. Then the surface begins to settle. It becomes smoother. It can dome slightly. In a clear container, you may see bubbles along the sides, little windows in the mass. Those small signs matter because they are easy to trust. They do not require a lecture. They are simply outcomes. And fermentation is something you recognize best by outcomes. Bread cooks often bring up gluten, and I want to keep that word gentle. Gluten is the stretchy web that forms when flour meets water and you mix it. Think of it as a net that can hold air. The yeast makes the air. The gluten helps keep it. That is why dough can become both lighter and stronger at the same time, and why good bread tears in tender threads instead of crumbling into dust. Time and temperature decide how fast all of this happens. Warmer dough tends to ferment faster. Cooler dough tends to take its time. I treat that like adjusting the flame under a pot, not like a rule you recite to prove you belong in the room. On busy days, that dial matters because bread has to fit around everything else. Sometimes I keep a bowl in a cooler corner, away from vents and heat, so the rise does not sprint ahead of the rest of service. Other times, when we need dough sooner, it sits in a gently warm place where it can move at a steady pace. Either way, the point is not speed. The point is control. You are not forcing the dough. You are choosing a pace that makes sense for your night. Slower fermentation often builds more flavor. Time gives enzymes and microbes more room to do their quiet work. And the same basic ingredients can taste deeper, less one note, when the rise is allowed to stretch out. This is why you hear people talk about dough resting overnight in the fridge, especially for pizza. Cold makes everything quieter. The yeast slows down. The dough develops in a patient way. When you open a tub of cold fermented dough, the surface can feel firm and cool, with a smooth skin that looks almost satin. As it warms, it loosens. The smell shifts too, from mild and bready to something more fragrant, like wheat with a faint apple note. Not perfume, just a gentle reminder that fermentation has been happening even in the cold, like background music turned down low. A practical way to track dough, especially when the kitchen is busy and clocks stop feeling honest, is simple marking. A strip of tape on the side of a container. A quick line with a marker. The level it started at. The dough tells you its story by height. You can walk past and read it in a second without poking or worrying. When I do touch it, the check I trust most is still the fingertip press. Press lightly, then watch what the dough does. If it springs back instantly, it likely needs more time. If it stays collapsed and sticky, it may have gone too far. The sweet spot is in the middle, when the impression slowly eases back, like memory returning. That slow return is the dough saying, I have air, I have structure, and I am not exhausted. There are other signs too, and they are quieter. A well-fermenting dough can feel slightly puffy when you pick up the edge. It can look aerated under the surface, like a sponge tightened just enough to hold itself. It can feel tacky without being messy, and that detail matters more than people think. A dough that is bone dry can be easy to handle, but heavy to eat. A dough with a little tack can bake up lighter and more tender if you treat it with clean hands and calm movements. When I work with a stickier dough, I do not wrestle it. I wet my fingertips. I use a scraper to lift cleanly. I let the dough keep its softness instead of burying it under extra flour out of nervousness. The goal is not to win. The goal is to guide. Shaping is where yeast fermentation becomes something you can hold. You are taking all those invisible bubbles and arranging them. Too rough, and you pop the structure you waited for. Too timid, and the loaf spreads out and loses its lift. I keep it simple. I tuck the dough under itself with the side of my hand, building gentle tension on the surface. That tension helps the loaf rise up rather than out, and it makes the crust more likely to open cleanly in the oven. Around that moment, the tools are plain and honest. A dusting of flour that squeaks faintly on a steel table. A linen cloth that smells like clean cotton and yesterday's bread. A basket that leaves shallow ridges on the dough, like soft fingerprints. The whole scene is quiet enough that you can feel your own breathing again. When a loaf is nearly ready to bake, it carries a certain wobble. If you slide it onto a peel or set it onto a tray, it trembles slightly, like a cushion filled with air. There is a point in fermentation where the dough stops feeling like paste and starts feeling like a living pillow. It offers resistance, then gives. It holds shape, then relaxes. It is a balance that is hard to fake and easy to recognize once you have felt it a few times. Right before baking, I often score the top. That is simply making a controlled opening so the loaf can expand where you choose. The blade is quick, the movement is confident. The dough responds like fabric, not like clay. A timid cut can drag and tear. A clean cut opens like a seam, and the loaf has permission to bloom. The oven is where the waiting pays off quickly. Heat makes trapped gases expand. The yeast does a last burst of work before it slows down for good. The loaf rises rapidly in the first minutes. Bakers call it oven spring. Steam matters there in a practical way. A moist oven keeps the surface flexible for a little longer, so the loaf can expand before the crust sets. That can be a covered pot. It can be a small tray of water. It can be any simple method that adds moisture without turning the process into a performance. Then the smell begins. Not just bread, but layers, warm grain, a hint of sweetness, the toasty edge where flour and heat meet. It fills the kitchen in a way that makes tired bodies stand a little straighter, because smell is a kind of encouragement. When the loaf comes out, I listen. The crust often crackles as it cools, a thin, delicate sound, like dry leaves shifting. It is the bread settling into itself, releasing the last of its heat. Cutting too soon can make the inside look wet and feel tight. Waiting a little lets steam finish leaving, and the crumb sets into clean strands instead of smearing. I like to rest a loaf on a rack and let the crackle fade before I take the first slice. There is something calming about letting the bread finish becoming itself, even after it has left the oven, as if the night still has one last step to offer. When people say fermented bread, they sometimes mean sourdough, and sourdough has its own world of cultures. Without going deep, it helps to know that yeast and bacteria can work side by side there, creating both lift and a gentle tang. But the core lesson stays steady. Yeast fermentation is bubbles you cannot see, held by a stretchy web, shaped by time and temperature, and made real by a loaf that rises like a slow inhale. If you want one simple sign to hold on to, let it be this. Dough is not quiet because nothing is happening. Dough is quiet because the work is happening too evenly to shout. And when the kitchen settles again, when the oven door closes, when the air turns warm and toasty for a while and then fades, The bread feels like something the night helped make, patient and alive, made of very little, changed by time. There is a kind of smell that can wake a tired palate faster than heat ever could. It is the clean, bright sting you catch when you open a bottle of vinegar. And for a second, the air feels sharper, as if someone drew a thin line around the room. In most kitchens, vinegar sits quietly among the everyday tools, shoulder to shoulder, with salt and oil. It looks plain. It behaves like a simple liquid, but its story is a long chain of small changes, and I like it for that reason. It is fermentation that has finished its journey and agreed to become useful on demand. The most reliable way to understand vinegar is simple. In many traditional pathways, yeast and thyme first help turn sugar into alcohol, and then bacteria take that alcohol and turn it into acetic acid. That acetic acid is what we recognize as vinegar. You do not have to remember every step to feel it. You can taste the pathway if you pay attention. Alcohol carries a warmth and a faint sweetness, like a soft glow behind the tongue. Vinegar carries a snap and a lift, like the flavor has been tightened gently, pulled into focus, and given a clean edge. The transformation is not the same as the lactic tang we talked about earlier. Lactic sour tends to arrive with rounded shoulders and a steady presence. Vinegar sour is usually more direct. It can feel like a quick tap on the tongue, clean and clear, and then it steps back, leaving space for everything else to speak. In a working kitchen, that quickness is not just interesting, it is practical. Vinegar can do in a moment what a long simmer sometimes cannot. It can make a soup feel finished. It can make a sauce feel awake. It can cut through richness the way a window opens in a warm room, and the air suddenly feels breathable. I have learned not to treat that as a trick, and not to treat it as a rescue either. I treat it as shape. When I'm tired, my hand can be clumsy, and vinegar is not forgiving. That is why I keep a small ceramic dish near my station for tasting acids. I pour into the dish first, even if it is only a teaspoon. That little detour slows me down. It gives me one extra step where I can smell, taste, and decide. I do not trust myself to pour straight from a bottle into a pot at the end of a long night. When my eyes are heavy and the kitchen is louder inside my head than it is in the room. The dish keeps the balance honest. Vinegar is not one flavor. The base matters, and the base leaves a fingerprint. Wine vinegar can carry a faint echo of grapes and barrels, a little roundness behind the bite, as if the sourness is wearing a soft coat. Cider vinegar can lean toward apple peel and orchard sweetness, even when the sourness is bright. Rice vinegar is often lighter and gentler, with an edge that feels easy to fold into food without taking over. I like those differences because they give me options that are not loud. Some nights, I want brightness without a sharp corner, and a mild vinegar does that work. Some nights, I want a clean snap, a clear line through a rich dish, and I choose something more assertive. There are vinegars that have been aged longer, and you can usually sense it without needing to know the exact years. The aroma tells you first. A younger vinegar can smell bright and simple, like it is all light and lift. An aged vinegar can smell darker, sometimes a little sweeter, sometimes more complex, like fruit that has been cooked down slowly until it is glossy. Even the way it clings to the spoon can feel different. A thin vinegar falls away quickly. A more aged, more concentrated vinegar can linger for a moment, leaving a slow trail that feels almost syrupy. even when it is still clearly sour. I do not romanticize it, I just notice it. In this kitchen, noticing is enough. There is also a living detail people forget, especially now that vinegar is mostly sold as something finished and stable. Sometimes a bottle will develop a cloudy film or a gelatinous-looking mass, often called a mother. If you have never seen it, it can look strange, like something went wrong, but it is often simply part of the fermentation community that remains present. In a clean vinegar, it is not a warning sign by itself. It is a reminder. Fermentation is not an idea. It is life doing work. And sometimes life leaves evidence in the bottle. If you strain it out, the vinegar can still be perfectly fine. If you leave it, the bottle may simply keep evolving slowly in its own quiet way. I like that. It makes the kitchen feel honest. Not everything is polished. Not everything has to pretend it was never alive. When I cook, I think of acid as a bridge. It connects flavors that would otherwise sit apart, like neighbors who share a wall but never speak. Salt makes flavors clearer. Fat makes them linger. Acid makes them rise. That is why a heavy dish can feel suddenly lighter with one small touch of vinegar at the end. It does not erase richness, it outlines it. It puts a clean line around the flavor so your mouth can understand it more easily. I find that especially helpful with long-cooked foods. A pot that has been simmering for hours can taste deep but slightly sleepy, as if all the notes have settled into the same low register. A bright acid can bring back definition, like tracing the edges of a drawing you already like. The dish does not become new. It becomes readable. Sometimes I use vinegar to balance sweetness too, because sweetness can be heavy in its own way. Tomato sauces are a good example. Tomatoes carry their own sweet and acid story, and depending on the fruit and the season, a sauce can lean one way or the other. A small extra brightness can sharpen the tomato flavor instead of making it taste simply sour. The same idea applies to vegetables that lean sweet when cooked. Carrots, onions, squash. When they roast, their sugars become more present, and the dish can start to feel round and warm and a little too soft at the edges. A touch of acid can keep that sweetness from turning sleepy. It wakes the flavor without raising the volume. This is where people sometimes misunderstand sourness. They think sour means harsh. They think vinegar means punishment. It does not have to. Sourness is a sensation, not a personality. When acid is balanced with salt, fat, or even a small touch of sweetness, it can feel rounded. It can feel friendly. It can feel like the dish is standing up straighter, not shouting. I like that distinction, especially at night, when the kitchen is quiet and the goal is not intensity. The goal is ease. The goal is clarity that does not demand attention. There is a small habit I use when I'm working with vinegar, and it is simple enough to borrow without turning cooking into a ritual you have to perform perfectly. I smell the bottle first, with the cap still close. Then I pour a little into that ceramic dish. I take one small taste, not a sip, just enough to register the sharpness, the base notes, the sweetness, if it has any, the way it lands and leaves. Then I step back and ask the only question that matters. What does the dish need? Not more flavor exactly, more shape, more air, more lift. It is the same question I ask when I reach for salt, but vinegar answers it faster. One drop can change the whole contour of a pot. Ascetic fermentation also reminds me that fermentation is not one method. It is a family of relationships. Sometimes we guide microbes toward lactic acid and a rounded tang. Sometimes we guide them toward carbon dioxide and lift-in dough. Sometimes we guide them toward acetic acid and the clean snap of vinegar. The end results feel different, but the logic is similar. You set up conditions. You keep them steady. You let time do work that hands alone cannot do. Vinegar is what happens when that work is allowed to complete, then bottled and carried into the everyday. Because it is concentrated, vinegar teaches restraint. Too much, and the dish narrows into sourness. The goal is rarely to taste vinegar as the main character. The goal is to feel its effect the way you feel a light turn on behind a curtain. The room is the same room, but suddenly you can see the corners. That is what good acidity does. It gives the food edges without making it hard. It gives it a clean finish without making it cold. If you want a gentle way to think about vinegar without turning it into chemistry, think of it as a quick kind of definition. A pot of beans can be delicious and still feel slightly flat at the end. A stew can be rich and still feel like it needs one clean breath. A simple salad can be fresh and still feel like the flavors are standing too far apart. Vinegar is one of the easiest ways to draw those things together. Not by adding complexity, but by adding direction. It points the flavor where it already wanted to go. And because it is such an ordinary thing, it can be easy to forget how strange it is. Something sweet becomes alcohol. Alcohol becomes acid. Acid becomes a tool that can live on a shelf and wait. In the quiet kitchen at night, I like that kind of patience. I like an ingredient that does not beg for attention, but is ready the moment you need it. A quick lift of aroma, a clean edge on the tongue, a dish that feels complete, as if it finally knows what it is supposed to be. There is a kind of savory depth that does not come from a pan or a flame or a long simmer. It comes from something quieter, something that feels like the food has been patiently unfastened, little by little, until it can release more of itself. If you have ever tasted a broth that suddenly felt wider, or a sauce that seemed to gain a low, steady warmth without getting heavier, you have already met the effect I mean. Tonight, I want to keep that feeling close and understandable. We are going to talk about koji and what it does in a way you can hold in your hands, even if you never grow it, even if you never name it, even if it just shows up in a spoonful of paste dissolved into a pot at midnight. The first time I heard the word koji, I assumed it was going to be complicated. The word sounded like a locked door. The truth is simpler than my imagination. Koji is a cultivated mold that people have used for a long time to start certain ferments, especially in Japanese cooking and in related traditions across the region. That sentence can still feel a little abstract, so I like to translate it into kitchen language. Koji is not a seasoning you sprinkle. It is not a trick. It is a helper you invite in, and the help it brings is not loud. In practice, I think of koji as a guest who arrives carrying tools. Not a hammer, not a knife, not anything you can hear strike a board. Koji brings enzymes. Enzymes are just tiny workers that break large food molecules into smaller pieces. That can sound technical, so here is the quiet version you can picture. Food holds its flavor inside bigger structures, starches, proteins, and the bonds that keep them feeling sturdy. Koji helps loosen those structures. It encourages starches to become sugars that taste sweeter and more round. It encourages proteins to become smaller pieces that taste deeper and more savory. It does not force flavor into the food. It helps reveal what was already there, only folded in. This is one reason a plain grain can become a foundation for something rich. It is also one reason a ferment can develop that particular kind of fullness people call umami, the savory taste you find in broth, roasted meat, aged cheese, and long-cooked mushrooms. Umami is not a spice. It is not a single note. It is a sensation of depth, like the flavor has a lower register, like the food has a baseline. When koji is involved, that baseline can feel steady and calm, not sharp, not flashy, just present. Miso is one of the easiest places to meet koji's influence, even if you never see the mold itself. Miso is a paste made from fermented ingredients, often soybeans, sometimes rice or barley, plus salt, and a starter culture that commonly involves koji. It can ferment for months, sometimes longer, and that time becomes part of its personality. When you open a tub of miso, you are not smelling one simple thing. You are smelling layers. There can be a faint nuttiness, like toasted seeds. There can be the warm, grainy scent of rice that has been gently browned. There can be something that reminds you of soy, but softer, more rounded. Sometimes, there is even a hint that feels like dried fruit or mushrooms, not in a loud way, not like perfume, just in passing, like a small memory. Miso also varies a lot, and I do not like to turn that into homework. Some misos are lighter in color, often tasting a bit sweeter and milder, with a cleaner edge. Some misos are darker and tend to taste deeper, saltier, sometimes more assertive, as if the flavors have had more time to concentrate and mingle. People have names for categories, and those names can be useful. But at night, I do not memorize lists. I smell, and I taste a small dab. The tongue tells you whether it is meant to be gentle or bold. The aroma tells you whether it leans grainy, nutty, caramel-like, or earthy. And the texture tells you how it will dissolve, whether it will disappear smoothly or leave a little rustic thickness behind. In a working kitchen, I use miso the way I use a good stock base, not as a shortcut, but as structure. A small spoon can make a broth feel more complete, as if it has been simmering longer than it actually has. It can round out a vegetable soup. It can give a simple sauce a backstory, the feeling that it has been cared for. I have watched a pot go from fine to finished with a quiet stir. Not because miso is magic, but because it carries built-in balance, salt, sweetness, depth, and that low umami note that helps flavors hold together. There is one practical detail I always share with newer cooks, and it is not a strict rule, more like a habit that protects the aroma. Miso's scent can fade if it is boiled hard for too long. I like to stir it in off the heat, or at least after the pot has stopped roaring, so the fragrance stays present. Think of it like lowering your voice in a quiet room. You can say the same words, but if you do not shout them, they land better. When miso is treated gently, it keeps more of its character. When it is boiled hard, it can still taste salty and savory, but it loses some of the soft, toasty bloom that makes it feel alive. Koji shows up beyond miso too. Many soy sauces involve a fermentation process that begins with koji breaking down grains and beans into sugars and amino acids that later microbes can work with. Some rice wines and other fermented drinks involve koji as part of turning starch into fermentable sugars. You do not need to chase the full map tonight. The useful idea is that koji helps unlock food. It is not turning one ingredient into another by brute force. It is more like opening a box and taking out what was already inside, only hidden under wrapping. That is why the flavor feels so deep. It feels revealed, not added. When something is revealed, it tends to integrate more naturally. It does not sit on top of the dish like a garnish that announces itself. It spreads through the whole bowl. It becomes part of the structure, not a decoration. This is also where fermentation teaches a kind of restraint. Koji-driven flavors can be powerful, but they are not meant to overwhelm. They are meant to support. They are meant to make the food feel more itself. There is a texture lesson inside this part of fermentation too. When starches and proteins are broken into smaller pieces, pastes can become smoother, sauces can become silkier, and foods can taste like they have been gently blended, even if you never touched a blender. A spoonful of miso, stirred into warm liquid, disappears in a way that feels almost graceful. It is there, but it does not sit on the surface. It integrates. The broth turns slightly cloudy, sometimes tan, sometimes pale gold, and the mouthfeel becomes fuller without becoming heavy. That quiet thickening is not cream. It is the sense of cohesion, like the soup has stopped being separate ingredients and started being one thing. This is where fermentation becomes a quiet craft. You cannot rush it. You can only set conditions and let the work unfold. Salt is part of that condition, and miso tends to be salty. That salt is not only taste, it is also guidance. It helps shape which microbes thrive, and it helps keep the ferment stable over long stretches of time. Because miso is strong, it also teaches measurement by feel. You do not need much. A little goes a long way. When it is right, you do not necessarily say, "This tastes like miso." You say, "This tastes fuller. This tastes steadier. This tastes like it knows what it is doing." On a late shift, when I'm making staff meal with whatever is left in the bins, miso is one of the tools that can turn scraps into comfort. A pot of broth with vegetable trimmings that would otherwise be thrown away. A spoon of miso for depth. A handful of noodles or leftover rice. Or a few mushrooms that are slightly tired but still good. Suddenly, the bowl feels intentional. It feels like a meal, not an accident. That is part of why I respect fermentation. It makes use of what is already there, and it does it without noise. I used to scoop miso with any spoon that happened to be nearby, then drop it straight into the pot, and it would clump and sink, leaving salty pockets that surprised the first person who tasted. Now, I do something slower, and it is such a small ritual that it barely counts as effort. I smear the miso against the side of a warm ladle, or I stir it in a small bowl with a splash of broth until it becomes smooth. Then I pour that back into the pot. I watch it dissolve into a ribbon, spreading evenly. The result tastes balanced instead of spiky. The aroma rises more gently. The first sip feels calm. There is also something quietly beautiful about the idea of starters in fermentation. Koji is a starter that does not just live. It provides tools. It prepares the food so other microbes and time can build something larger. When I think about fermentation this way, it stops feeling like mystery and starts feeling like collaboration. You invite the right helpers, you keep the environment steady, and you let the food become more expressive. If you want to hold a single sensory memory from this part, make it this: the smell of miso as it meets warm water, Not boiling water, not a rolling pot, just warmth. There is a brief bloom of toasted grain and savory richness like the first breath when you open a pantry where dried mushrooms and rice are stored together. That bloom is small, but unmistakable. It is fermentation speaking in a low voice, with a long history behind it, and it does not ask you to understand every detail. It only asks you to notice what changes when the night is quiet and the food is given time to open. When you spend enough nights in kitchens, you start to trust your senses the way you trust your tools. A knife tells you one story, heat tells you another. Fermentation has its own language and it speaks in small signals. The helpful thing is that you do not need perfect knowledge to understand those signals. You just need a steady way of noticing. I think of it like this. Fermentation rarely announces itself with one dramatic sign. It shows up as a pattern across smell, sound, texture, and sight. And the pattern is what you learn to read. Early on, many ferments still smell like their starting ingredients. Milk smells like milk. Cabbage smells like cut greens. Dough smells like damp flour and grain. Then, gradually, the aroma begins to shift. The raw edge fades. A brighter note arrives. Sometimes fruity, sometimes cleanly tangy, sometimes like warm cereal. If you have ever walked past a bakery early in the morning, you know that scent that feels both sweet and bready at once. That is fermentation in the air, not just baking. With vegetables, the first stage often tastes like salt and freshness. It can feel blunt, as if the flavor has not decided what it wants to be yet. Later, the taste sharpens, but not always in a harsh way. There is often a clean tang, like the difference between plain water and mineral water, a subtle bite that makes your mouth pay attention. That clarity is one of fermentation's steady signatures. It is not identical in every food, but it often shows up as focus, as definition, as a kind of bright outline. Sound is the sign people want most, because it feels like proof. Bubbles are satisfying, but bubbling is not a universal meter. Some ferments are loud with fizz. Some are nearly silent even when they are active. A jar of vegetables might show tiny beads rising from the bottom now and then nothing for hours. A thick dairy culture might barely move at all, but it can still be working evenly. In liquids, carbonation-like sounds can appear. A faint crackle when you pour. A tiny pop when a bubble reaches the surface and breaks. In dough, sound is more indirect. It is the way the dough exhales when you uncover it. That brief release of trapped air, like a quiet sigh that disappears immediately. If you are listening from bed, you can imagine that absence of noise more than the noise itself. A covered bowl that seems still, and yet inside it, tiny bubbles are forming and holding, the way weather gathers behind a closed window. Texture is the sign I rely on when the kitchen is busy and my nose is tired. Texture does not lie as easily as aroma can, especially when you are surrounded by other smells. Vegetables in a lactic ferment often soften without turning mushy. They become flexible, with a bite that gives, then snaps back lightly. The fibers relax. The crunch changes from stiff to structured, like something that has learned how to bend without breaking. Dairy ferments teach the same lesson in a smoother way. Milk thickens. Cream becomes spoonable. The surface becomes glossy, then set, as if the liquid has decided to hold its shape. Fermented pastes show texture in how they dissolve. A paste that breaks down smoothly into warm liquid is telling you It has been worked on patiently, by time, until it can integrate without a fight. That integration is a quiet kind of evidence. It does not announce itself the way steam does, but it shows up in the way the mouth feels comforted rather than startled. Now sight. Many people expect a ferment to stay clear and pristine. In reality, activity often makes things look a little less tidy. A brine can turn cloudy. Fine sediment can collect at the bottom. Tiny particles can float and then settle when you stop moving the jar. In vegetable ferments, cloudiness is often just the liquid holding on to life and minerals and microscopic debris from the food itself. It can look like a pale fog in the glass, the way a bathroom mirror fogs after a hot shower. Color changes tend to be subtle. Greens can soften into paler shades. Reds can deepen. Spices can bleed into the liquid, staining it slowly, like tea steeping. One of my favorite visual cues is the way bubbles cling to surfaces. You might see a string of tiny pearls along the side of a jar, or trapped between cabbage leaves, as if the food is wearing a light necklace. It is not a show. It is just the ferment doing its work, leaving small marks behind. If you want a simple sensory map, think in stages. Stage 1 often smells clean and raw, and tastes mostly like the original ingredient plus salt or sweetness. Stage 2 often brings movement, a little fizz, a clearer tang, a scent that shifts from raw to bright. Stage 3 often brings depth. The sharpness rounds out. The aroma becomes more integrated. The food tastes like one thing instead of separate parts. Those stages are not rigid, and they overlap. They also move at different speeds depending on temperature and the kind of ferment. This is where it helps to use your senses together. A single sign can mislead you. A pattern is easier to trust. If the smell is clean and developing, the texture is improving, and the look matches gentle activity, that combination tells you more than any one bubble ever could. I keep that in mind because kitchens can trick you. If you have been standing near onions, your nose becomes unreliable. If you have been tasting salt all night, your tongue can dull out. So I build small habits that keep my senses fresh. A sip of water, a breath of neutral air near a cold door, a pause before tasting so I can smell first. There is also a difference between sharp and alive. A fermented aroma can be sharp in a clean way, like citrus peel, like brine, like yogurt tang. It feels focused. When something smells confusing, smeared, or heavy in a way that does not fit the food, that is when I stop trying to interpret one single note and return to the full picture. What is the texture doing? What does a tiny taste say? What does the surface look like? That full picture is what makes fermentation feel less mysterious. You are not guessing. You are reading. I want to give you a few sensory anchors you can keep in your pocket, so each kind of ferment keeps its own voice. For lactic vegetable ferments, the anchor is a bright, clean tang that smells a little fruity with a briny edge, and vegetables that bend without collapsing. For yeast-driven ferments, the anchor is lift and aeration. A dough that becomes puffy, a scent that turns from wet flour to warm grain, a surface that looks smoother, like it is relaxed. For acidic pathways, the anchor is quick brightness in the nose, a crisp snap on the tongue, and a scent that rises fast and clears the air. For enzyme-rich ferments like miso, the anchor is depth that blooms slowly, with aromas that feel toasted, nutty, and savory, and a taste that lingers low rather than striking high. If you keep those anchors separate, fermentation stops being one big category and becomes a set of familiar voices. You do not have to name them perfectly. You just have to recognize who is speaking. I also pay attention to the way containers behave, because containers tell stories even when the food is quiet. A lid can show you pressure changes. A glass jar can show you settling. A crock can show you moisture, the way the surface gathers tiny droplets and then dries again. Even the outside tells a story. A cold jar that sweats when it comes into warmer air. A clean rim that stays clean. A sticky rim that tells you the liquid climbed and dried there. I used to shake jars to check them, which was mostly impatience, and I would end up with brine up the sides and a smell that lingered on my hands. Now I set the jar down, tap it once to release bubbles clinging to the glass, and wipe the counter edge where it sits. I prefer that quieter check because it keeps the aroma clear and it keeps the space calm. Another cue people overlook is the way fermentation changes how food absorbs seasoning. A fermented vegetable can taste more seasoned without adding more salt, because the flavor becomes sharper and more integrated. A fermented dairy product can taste richer even when it is not heavy, because the tang adds structure. That structure is part of why fermented foods feel satisfying. They are not just flavored, they are shaped. If you are listening in the dark, you can imagine this sensory map the way you imagine weather. A raw ingredient is like clear air. Fermentation introduces pressure systems, tiny movements, a change in brightness. You might not see the wind, but you notice what it does to leaves. You might not see microbes, but you notice what they do to food. The more you notice, the more ordinary it becomes. Fermentation stops feeling like a special project and starts feeling like a quiet background process humans have always lived alongside. And that is the comfort of it, at least for me. There is a jar resting somewhere, on a shelf, on a counter, in a fridge. Small bubbles rising when nobody is watching. A scent changing by degrees. Hold on to one last cue, something simple you can trust. When you lift the lid and the first breath that reaches you smells cleanly tangy, not raw anymore, that is often the sign that time has begun to do its steady work. Fermentation can look modern when you see it lined up in neat jars on a bright counter, labels facing forward, glass clean and clear. But the practice itself is older than most of the tools we think of as essential. Older than refrigerators. Older than packaged yeast. Older than written recipes in many places. Long before people could control cold, they learned something quieter and more patient. They learned that time itself could be recruited, not as a threat, not as a gamble, but as a partner. Many historians suggest fermentation began as a practical discovery rather than an invention. Food left in the right conditions changed. Sometimes it spoiled, but sometimes it did something else entirely. The taste improved, the texture softened or sharpened in useful ways, and often the food held on longer than it would have otherwise. That last part mattered deeply. When you live by seasons, abundance arrives in short, intense windows. Then it leaves. Fermentation gave people a way to stretch those windows, to carry something fresh into weeks and months when the fields were quiet and the pantry was simple. I think about that whenever I see a jar of vegetables resting on a shelf. It is not just a trend or a technique. It is a small version of a very old decision. Take what is here now, while it is good, and let it become something that can last. Let it change slowly instead of losing it all at once. Bread is one of the most familiar examples, and also one of the most quietly astonishing. Grain can be stored for a long time, but flour still has limits, and dough is fragile. Fermentation gave dough lift, and it gave it flavor. It made bread lighter, more fragrant, and for many people, easier to digest. It made the labor of grinding grain and baking feel worthwhile, because the result was more than sustenance. It was comfort. In different places, bread took different shapes. Flatbreads cooked quickly on hot surfaces. Loaves baked slowly in ovens. Steamed buns rising in baskets. Sourdoughs kept alive like a household companion, fed and tended day after day. The forms changed, but the relationships stayed the same. Flour, water, microbes, and waiting. Beer and wine belong to that same family. Fruits and grains already contain sugars. Yeast turns those sugars into alcohol, and people learn to guide that change into something social and celebratory, as well as practical. In many times and places, fermented drinks became part of daily life, not as indulgence, but as a reliable option when fresh water was uncertain or when crops needed to be preserved in another form. The details differ by region and era, but the pattern repeats. Sweetness meets time. Time meets microbes. Something new emerges. Cheese carries its own long lineage. Milk is generous, but it spoils quickly. Fermentation and curdling turn it into something that holds longer, travels better, and develops a depth that fresh milk does not have. The range is enormous, from fresh and mild to aged and deeply aromatic. Much of that range comes down to time doing its work in the background, slowly concentrating flavor, changing texture, and building complexity without constant attention. Vegetable ferments appear across the world in different accents. In Korea, kimchi became not just a food, but a seasonal rhythm, prepared in large batches and allowed to develop character as winter settled in. In parts of Europe, fermented cabbage became sauerkraut, a way to turn harvested greens into something bright through the cold months. In many regions, pickled vegetables show up in some form, sometimes driven by lactic fermentation, sometimes guided by vinegar, sometimes shaped by whatever salt, vessels, and climate were available. The details change, but the intention is familiar. Keep vegetables alive a little longer. Give them a sharper voice when fresh flavors are scarce. Yogurt has its own wide geography, appearing across Central Asia, West Asia, and beyond. The same basic idea repeats. Warm milk, living cultures, time, a thickening that feels like reassurance. The result is not just preservation, but transformation. Milk becomes something that can be spooned, shared, and paired with other foods to cool heat or soften spice. In Southeast and East Asia, fermented sauces and pastes became cornerstones of cooking. Soy sauces, fish sauces, bean pastes, and other long-aged seasonings carry an intensity that is difficult to create any other way. They function like condensed time. A small amount can add depth, salt, and savoriness at once. They are not meant to dominate. They are meant to support, to shape the rest of the dish quietly. The specifics of how these foods are made differ, and each tradition carries its own rules, rituals, and stories. but the common thread is easy to recognize. People learn to create conditions where certain microbes and enzymes could do useful work. Then they learn to repeat those conditions reliably. That repetition is what turns a discovery into a craft. Much of this knowledge lived in the body, not on the page. You can see it in the way someone packs vegetables down firmly, without measuring, trusting pressure and feel. You can hear it when elders talk about a ferment being ready, as if readiness has a face they recognize. You can taste it in the way one family's sourness is slightly different from the next, and both are considered right. That kind of knowledge travels through routine rather than instruction. It is learned by doing, by watching, by adjusting. In restaurants, I see the same pattern play out. Every kitchen has a house sour, a preferred pickle, a bread that feels right for that space. Even when recipes are standardized, there is always a human layer of judgment. The room is warmer tonight. The dough is moving faster. The jar tastes brighter than it did yesterday. Adjust. Fermentation demands attention, but not obsession. It asks you to notice and respond. Fermentation also followed people as they moved. Trade routes carried grains, salt, spices, and techniques. Along with those, microbes traveled quietly too, not as named passengers, but as background life clinging to food, to hands, to vessels, to cloth. Old methods adapted to new ingredients. New climates reshaped old habits. That is one reason fermentation is so diverse. It is universal because microbes and sugars exist everywhere. It is local because climate, salt availability, containers, and taste preferences change the outcome. Even the vessels tell part of the story. Earthenware crocks that breathe, wooden barrels that hold their own communities, clay pots buried to keep temperatures steady, glass jars that let you watch. Each choice shapes the ferment gently, the way different rooms shape the same conversation. Nothing dramatic, just a subtle influence over time. Sometimes people speak about fermentation with reverence, as if it were mystical. I understand why. Change that happens slowly and invisibly can feel like magic. But what moves me more is how ordinary it is. Fermentation is proof that humans have always been observant. We notice what works, we remember it, we repeat it, we pass it down. Even now, with modern storage and convenience, we return to fermentation because it makes food taste alive. Not in a trendy way, in a human way. There is also a social comfort to it. Ferments often happen in batches. They invite sharing. A crock on a table, a bowl of yogurt beside something spicy, a slice of bread passed across a counter. These foods carry time with them, and time has a way of slowing conversations down. In my own kitchen, fermentation is rarely the center of the plate. It is the supporting note that makes everything else feel complete. A spoon of miso, a bit of tang, a crisp bite on the side. But at the end of service, when the stainless steel is wiped down and the room settles into its hum, I sometimes think about how old these tastes are. A jar resting on a shelf looks modern, but the practice is ancient. It is the same quiet agreement people have always made with time. Set the conditions. Let the kitchen keep working while we sleep. The kitchen does not need to be loud to feel connected to history. Sometimes it is a towel hung to dry, a lid set slightly askew, and a ferment changing in the dark. Some people come to fermentation believing it only works for the lucky. Or for those who measure everything twice and never make a mistake. I understand that feeling. A living process can seem unpredictable when you are tired and you want a clean, final answer. But in practice, most mix-ups are small and ordinary. They are the same kinds of missteps we make with any food when we rush, when we overthink, or when we change too many things at once and forget what actually mattered. One common myth is that fermentation requires special equipment, fancy jars, valves, tools that promise control. Most of the time, what fermentation really asks for is consistency. A clean container, a steady spot on the counter, the patience to let flavor take its own shape. When those conditions are stable, the process tends to find its way without drama. Another mix-up is thinking the goal is constant activity. People want the ferment to look busy every time they check on it. They want bubbles right away, visible motion, proof that something is happening. But many good ferments look calm on the surface. They work quietly underneath, and they do it on their own schedule. Stillness does not mean failure. Often, it means the work has settled into a steady rhythm. I also see people confuse strong with wrong. Fermented foods can smell bold, especially when you first open a container and the trapped aroma escapes all at once. That first breath can feel sharp in the nose. Then it often softens into something more familiar. The question I ask myself is not whether it is intense, but whether it smells clean for what it is. Does it smell like brine, grain, dairy tang, fruit skin, toasted notes? Does it belong to the family of that food? Context matters. A sour aroma in yogurt can be normal. The same note in plain milk is not. That is why I do not judge by a single impression. I pause. I smell again. I look at texture. If tasting makes sense, I take a very small taste. Temperature causes another set of quiet disappointments. Warmth can push a ferment to move quickly, and speed is not always kind to flavor. If a container sits near a stove vent, on top of a dishwasher, or in a patch of afternoon sun, the ferment can race. When that happens, the taste can feel narrow, as if it skipped over a sweeter, rounder middle stage. When I want balance, I give the ferment a steadier corner. Not cold, just stable. Away from the oven door, away from constant shifts. A related mistake is changing the environment every time you check. Opening the container often, stirring often, moving it from place to place. Fermentation likes routine. The less you interrupt it, the easier it is for it to develop a clear personality. I think of it the way I think of a resting dough. Every unnecessary touch resets something small. Salt brings its own set of mix-ups, and they are not always obvious. Some people undersalt because they worry about taste, and the ferment can feel flat and uncertain. Some people oversalt and slow the process so much that it never becomes lively, just salty. I try not to treat salt like a moral decision. I treat it like a setting. The right range depends on the food and on what you want the end result to feel like. Another quiet detail is that not all salt behaves the same. Fine salt dissolves quickly. Coarse salt dissolves more slowly. Some salts contain additives that change how they flow. In a working kitchen, we choose a salt and stick with it. Not because it is magical, but because consistency makes the process easier to repeat. Air exposure is another place people get tangled. Some ferments prefer less oxygen. Some need it. If you handle them the same way, results can feel confusing. A vegetable ferment meant to stay under brine does best when it stays submerged. When bits of food rise above the liquid and dry out, they can taste dull, and the top can take on a different character than the rest. A vinegar-style ferment is different. It happens where air meets liquid. In that case, sealing it too tightly can slow the path you are trying to encourage. Even lids matter. Over-tightening can trap pressure and make a container feel tense. Leaving a lid too loose can invite evaporation, which concentrates salt and shifts texture. I like lids that are steady and predictable. In my world, boring is a compliment. There is also the very human habit of chasing a finish line too early. Many ferments taste awkward in the middle. They taste like they are still deciding who they are. If you taste too soon, it is easy to think nothing is working. Often, it is working perfectly, and it simply needs time to round out. The same impatience shows up with dough. People see some rise and assume it is ready, then bake too early and end up with bread that tastes plain or feels tight inside. Patience is not about waiting dramatically. It is about letting the process become coherent. To keep myself honest, I write small notes, not a journal, just a piece of tape with a date and a word like cabbage or dough. It stops me from guessing, and it keeps me from asking the same question over and over. I also keep my tools simpler than my thoughts. A clean spoon for tasting, a clean towel for wiping rims, a quick rinse of weights or lids. That kind of quiet housekeeping prevents a lot of confusion later. There is a mix-up I see in both restaurants and home kitchens. People try to fix a ferment by adding too many things at once. A little more salt, then sugar, then spices, then warmth, then cold. Suddenly, no one can tell what changed, and the ferment loses its center. If I need to adjust, I adjust one thing and then let it sit. Fermentation responds better to small, calm changes than to a flurry of corrections. I also learned to care for the tasting itself. I used to taste straight from the container with whatever spoon was closest, leaving streaks on the rim that dried into a sharp smell by the next day. Now, I keep a small cup of clean tasting spoons by the sink, and I wipe the rim with a damp towel that smells faintly of soap and hot water. I prefer that habit because the aroma stays true and the batch tastes the same from top to bottom. Another gentle correction is learning the difference between busy flavor and developed flavor. Some ferments taste loud but shallow. Others taste deep without shouting. I like to imagine a new ferment as a bright sketch and a longer ferment as a finished drawing. Not necessarily stronger, just more complete. Side-by-side tasting makes that difference clearer, even if the comparison exists only in your memory. There are moments when the ferment is fine, but the cook is not. Your own senses shift. If you have been working near hot oil, your nose can feel coated. If you have been sipping coffee, your tongue can feel sharp. If you have been tasting sauces all night, salt can disappear. When I want to judge fermentation fairly, I take a sip of water, wait a few breaths, smell first, then taste second. That pause resets more than you might expect. Most of the time, the path forward is simple. Keep conditions steady. Keep tools clean. Taste small. Let time do what it does. If something feels like it is circling the same point, I summarize it for myself in one sentence. Too warm. Too often disturbed. Too many changes. Then I stop fiddling and let the batch settle. Fermentation rewards the cook who can step back. Not because stepping back is virtuous, but because it gives the process room to become clear. Once you learn that rhythm, the common mix-ups stop feeling like failures. They feel like the normal learning curve of any craft, the kind you move through quietly, one better batch at a time. At the end of service, the fridge becomes the quietest worker in the building. It does not finish the job exactly. It slows everything down so you can come back tomorrow and still recognize what you made and what it was trying to become. That is one of the most useful truths about fermented foods. Cold usually slows fermentation rather than stopping it completely. The jar keeps breathing, just more softly, like a kitchen with the lights turned down low, not fully dark. And once you understand that, storage stops being a boring afterthought. It becomes another way of steering flavor. On the counter, a vegetable ferment can feel bright and crisp, almost eager. In the fridge, that same ferment often gathers itself. The tang can mellow. The garlic stops shouting and starts blending. Spices sink into the brine and stop floating like separate ideas. The whole jar tastes more integrated, as if the ingredients have finally agreed on one voice. I like that stage. It feels like the ferment has found its posture. In a working kitchen, we lean on that same principle all the time. A sauce that rests tastes more coherent. A soup that cools and reheats can taste deeper. Ferments take that ordinary kitchen wisdom and stretch it across days. The container matters more than people expect because fermentation likes steadiness. I reach for glass whenever I can. It is neutral. It does not hold on to old aromas the way some plastics can. It lets me see the brine line, the sediment, the occasional tiny bubbles that still show up even in the cold. In the fridge, I keep ferments in a shallow tray, not because I'm anxious, but because drips happen, and I like to protect my future self from a sticky shelf and a bad mood. A tidy fridge is a calmer kitchen. Labels help too. A strip of tape, a date, a short word, not a strict system, just enough to stop guessing. Fermentation is easier when you are not trying to remember what day you started, or when you last tasted, or whether this jar is the newer one or the older one. There is a small habit that makes a big difference, and it is not glamorous. Wipe the rims and lids before storage. Brine that dries on the threads of a jar turns into crusty edges and muddled aromas. It also makes opening the jar feel like a fight. And that is not the feeling I want at midnight. I want the lid to turn with a calm, familiar ease, not with a crack and a tug and a smell of old salt stuck where it does not belong. Keeping solids under brine is another kind of quiet care that changes the outcome. When vegetable bits float above the liquid, they dry out. They can taste dull, and they can develop a different texture than the rest of the jar. So I pack vegetables down and keep them submerged. Not obsessively, just enough that the liquid can do its job as a barrier, keeping the environment stable and the flavor consistent from top to bottom. Lids are their own small decision, and they matter because the goal changes depending on the stage. On the counter, some ferments do well with a lid set slightly loose, or with an airlock, because gases are being produced and need a place to go. In the fridge, once a ferment has reached a stage I like, I usually tighten the lid more. I am no longer asking for speed. I am asking for steadiness. The fridge is a dimmer switch, not a pause button, and a tighter seal helps the jar hold its shape, its aroma, and its balance. It also helps with another practical truth. Ferments can be aromatic, and they can also absorb odors if the container is not sealed well. A jar sitting near cut onions or strong cheese can pick up a ghost of those smells. It is not a disaster. It is just a reminder that living foods pay attention to their surroundings the way we do. The taste changes in the fridge in ways you can track with your senses if you slow down enough. Sourness often becomes less sharp. Aroma becomes more blended. Crunch can soften a little over longer stretches, but it often softens in a pleasant way, like the edge of a pickle becoming less rigid and more snackable. Salt levels can feel different with time, too. A brine that tasted bracing early on can taste more balanced later, not because the salt disappeared, but because it distributed more evenly through the vegetables, and because the whole jar became more integrated. This is why storage is part of flavor, not separate from it. The fridge is not just where you put something so it does not go bad. It is where you decide what kind of ferment you want to live with over the next week. Some ferments you want to keep active rather than simply preserved. A sourdough starter is the classic example. Cold slows it down. Then you bring it out and feed it, and it wakes up again. Even then, the fridge is still not a stop sign. It is a gentle break. I find that comforting because it means the work you did yesterday is still alive. Today, in a small way, the kitchen has continuity. Restaurants manage that continuity with routine. We rotate containers. We move older things forward. We keep the walk-in from becoming a museum of forgotten jars. At home, the same idea applies in a gentler form. Put the jars where you will actually see them. Keep the lids clean. Let yourself taste in small moments instead of waiting for a dramatic occasion. There is also something quietly satisfying about opening a cold jar. The glass turns slick with condensation when it meets warmer air. A faint chill rides out with the aroma. The brine line looks slightly higher because liquid shifts with temperature. It is a small sensory moment, but it reminds you are dealing with a living food, not a static one. I used to shove jars into the back of the fridge wherever there was space, then forget them until the lid was crusted and the flavor had drifted past what I wanted. Now, I give them one corner in a tray. I wipe the threads. I label the date in a thick marker that smells like alcohol ink. I prefer that simple routine because it protects the crunch, keeps the aroma clean, and keeps the taste in the range I actually enjoy. And if a ferment goes longer than you intended, that does not automatically mean it is ruined. Sometimes it just means it has grown more intense. A vegetable ferment can become very sour over time. A miso can taste more assertive after being open for a while. A kombucha can sharpen. In those moments, I try to think like a cook, not like a judge. How can it be used? Can a small amount brighten something? Can it be a background note instead of the main taste? Can it be balanced with fat, salt, or sweetness, the same way you balance any strong seasoning? That mindset keeps fermentation from feeling wasteful, and it keeps the kitchen calm. The kitchen does not need drama. It needs options. The last piece of storage care is simply paying attention to what you like. Some people prefer ferments young and crisp. Some prefer them older and deeper. There is no single correct point. only the point that fits your palate. Cold gives you time to choose that point. It gives you a wider window to catch the ferment where you want it, instead of feeling like you have to time it perfectly. And in the late kitchen, time is the most soothing ingredient we have. The jar goes back into its tray. The lid tightens with a small, familiar turn. Cold air meets warm air and makes a brief fog on the glass, then clears again. And the ferment rests there, steady, quietly continuing, while you let the night do the holding for you. By the time the dinner rush finally lets go, my palate is tired in a very specific way. Not numb, exactly. More like it has been listening to loud flavors for hours, and it wants a cleaner sentence. Something with space around it. Something you can breathe through. I rinse my hands, wipe the board, and let the room settle into that late shift quiet. The heat relaxes. The metal counters stop glaring. The air smells like soap, warm steel, and the faint sweetness of onions that did their slow work earlier in the night. That is one reason I keep fermented foods close. They bring definition, the way a good edit makes a paragraph suddenly readable. In my kitchen, fermentation is rarely the main event. It is the background note that helps the main flavors stay clear when the night has already asked a lot of my tongue. I do not reach for it to show off. I reach for it to steady the dish, to give it a clean line to follow, and to make the last bite feel as thoughtful as the first. Ferments taste like time doing patient work. They taste like change that was allowed to happen instead of forced. A spoon of yogurt can soften the edges of spice, not by covering it, but by giving it a cooler, tangier frame. A small smear of miso can make a simple broth taste like it has depth behind it, a low, savory tone that steadies everything else. Pickles do something different. They offer contrast. A crisp bite beside something warm and rich is not a trick. It is relief, a fresh start without leaving the table. When I build a plate, I think in textures as much as tastes. Soft and crisp, hot and cool, rich and bright. Fermented tang is often the easiest way to add that bright corner without changing the dish's identity. It lifts, it outlines, it makes the rest of the flavors feel like they know where they belong. In restaurants, there is a moment near the end of a dish when you stop cooking and start listening. That moment happens at the pass, when the pans come off the hardest heat and you can finally taste with intention. I taste, then I decide whether the dish needs one last adjustment. Salt is common. Fat is common. Acid is common. Fermented acidity is different because it carries flavor with it. It is not only brightness, it is aroma, sometimes a little funk, sometimes a sweetness that arrives late, like a back note you notice after the swallow. That complexity asks for restraint. If you push too hard, the ferment becomes the whole conversation, and the rest of the dish gets crowded out. I see that best in soups and broths. A broth can be clean and well-seasoned and still feel flat, like the flavors are lined up but not holding hands. A tiny amount of miso can connect the notes, giving the liquid a rounded base that makes the bowl feel complete. A small spoon of yogurt, stirred in gently, can add tang and body, making the surface feel silkier. Timing matters. Heat can dull aroma. Hard boiling can make delicate notes disappear. Overstirring can muddy texture. So I add fermented elements like punctuation, a small mark, then a pause, then I taste again. If it lands, I stop. If it does not, I step back and adjust in a different direction. Fermented foods teach you that small changes are often enough. Ferments help with sauces in the same quiet way. A little fermented paste can make a pan sauce taste like it has been simmering longer. A touch of fermented brine can make a vinaigrette feel sharper without needing extra sugar. Even a spoonful of pickle juice, used sparingly, can give a creamy dressing a brighter outline. On the line, the most practical tool is often a small ramekin of something fermented, kept close like a seasoning, so I can adjust without improvising wildly. A teaspoon can be too much, depending on the ferment. I prefer to sneak up on it, the way you raise the lights in a room slowly so no one squints. I want the dish to feel clearer, not louder. A lot of people think fermented foods are only for bold flavors. I do not agree. Ferments can be subtle when you use them as a whisper. Yogurt can make grilled vegetables taste sweeter because tang highlights natural sugars. A dot of miso folded into butter can make a quick sauce taste deeper, like it gained a browned note without extra time. Even fermented vegetables can be used lightly. A few fine shreds of sauerkraut tucked into a sandwich can add crunch and brightness without announcing itself as sauerkraut. It just tastes like the sandwich has better posture. It stands up straighter. It feels finished. I have one habit I lean on when a dish feels heavy. I reach for something that is both salty and sour, and I add it in the smallest possible amount. Then I taste again. If the dish suddenly feels balanced, I stop. If it still feels flat, I try something else, or I take the pot off the heat for a minute so the flavors can settle. That pause matters. Ferments bloom after you add them, and if you keep adjusting too fast, you chase that bloom and overshoot it. I learned that the hard way. I used to splash kimchi brine straight into a pan sauce and wonder why it turned sharp and crowded. Now, I dip a spoon, let a single drop fall, stir once, and stop. I give it a breath. Then I taste. The goal is not to add more. The goal is to arrive. Ferments also carry culture, and I mean that in two ways. They carry microbial communities, and they carry human habits. When I cook with miso, I am tasting a tradition, not just a paste. When I add yogurt to a dish, I am borrowing from kitchens that have used cultured dairy as balance for a very long time. When I set fermented vegetables on a plate, I am echoing a basic human idea. A meal is better with contrast. There is also the everyday reality that fermented foods can be strong. Not dangerous, not dramatic, just powerful in flavor, which means you often need fewer moves. A cook who learns to do less ends up with food that tastes more composed. I see it most clearly in staff meal, when I am using leftovers and there is no time to fuss. A pot of grains, roasted vegetables, whatever protein we have, and then one fermented element to bring the whole plate into focus. Sometimes it is yogurt with a pinch of salt. Sometimes it is pickles on the side. Sometimes it is miso dissolved into broth. One clear adjustment, and the meal suddenly feels like a decision, not a compromise. Fermentation teaches timing too. A dish fresh off the heat can feel scattered. The aroma is loud, but the taste is not settled. A short rest lets the components meet each other. Fermented additions behave the same way. They land in the dish, then they integrate. If you taste too quickly, you only get the top note. If you give it a minute, you get the full effect. That is why I like to add fermented elements, then take one small step back. Wipe the rim. Set down the spoon. Take a breath. Taste again. As the night winds down, I set the tasting spoons into the sink. rinse the last ramekins, and turn the heat lower on the warmer. The air smells less like cooking now, and more like clean metal and cooling food. I can hear the fridge hum, steady and patient, like it has all the time in the world. Somewhere inside it, a jar rests with its flavors still quietly knitting themselves together. That is the part I like most. The quiet work, the slow change, the feeling that you do not have to force anything for it to become better. By the end of a long day, I want food that feels settled into itself. Not rushed, not fussy, not trying to impress. Fermentation fits that mood. It is the opposite of panic cooking. It is patience made edible. If you keep one definition tonight, let it be this. Fermentation is a partnership between time, microbes, and the conditions you set, turning simple ingredients into deeper ones. Those conditions can be plain, a clean jar, a steady temperature, a pinch of salt, sometimes a culture, sometimes the natural life already on the food. Then you step back and let the quiet work unfold. Across this night in the kitchen, we've met fermentation in different voices. Lactic tang in vegetables and yogurt. Yeast lifting dough. Acidic brightness becoming vinegar. Enzyme-rich depth through starters like koji, leading to miso's warm savor. The science can stay in the background. The senses are enough. You recognize fermentation by how it changes the shape of things. A raw smell that turns cleanly tangy, a faint fizz that comes and goes like a small breath, a texture that shifts from rigid to pleasantly yielding, a cloudy brine that looks like pale weather inside glass. You can also recognize it by what it does to appetite. Fermented flavors often make you want another bite, not because they are louder, but because they create clarity. They put edges around richness. They add depth where plain food can feel flat. In my kitchen, that clarity is comfort. I spend all day managing heat, timing, and attention. Fermentation reminds me that some of the best work happens when you stop touching the food and let it become. When the rush is over, I wipe down the stainless steel until it looks dull and honest again. I rinse the last ladle, fold the towels, and let the room cool. The refrigerator hum takes over. In the back corner, containers rest, and fermentation keeps going in small, slow ways. If you're ready to sleep, keep only the sensory anchors: tang, lift, bright snap, savory bloom. Then let the work continue without you. One quiet bubble rising and disappearing, and the surface going still again.